You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
The time of the Empire has begun. Today we're talking all about the first installment of the Reign of the Empire trilogy, The Mask of Fear by Alexander Freed.
Welcome to Sky Talkers. Here are your hosts, Charlotte and Caitlin.
Hello and welcome to Sky Talkers. I'm your host, Charlotte.
Hey everyone, I'm your other host, Caitlin, and welcome to this week's episode where we are talking all about the Reign of the Empire, The Mask of Fear, book discussion. It has been more than a minute since we've done a book discussion here on the podcast.
Over a year.
I think it's been like 2 years.
It's crazy.
It's been a long time. Somehow it's been a long time. But what a book to come back to book discussions on the podcast with, The Mask of Fear. This is a book. This is a heavy, good book. You know what I mean?
Super well written.
Mm-hmm.
Really great. Pretty long, very serious, very political, very spy-y, and a perfect precursor to the new season of Andor that comes out next month. So what a joy to read. It took us a while. That's not saying anything about the book. It was heavy, right? And I feel like it took us both a while. So I'm really excited to talk about it. I'm excited for this return to form, to talking about books on the podcast. It's been a while. It's crazy.
It's been a long time.
Yeah. But the title of this book, The Mask of Fear, comes from Nemik's manifesto in Andor. And I just wanted to mention that sort of at the top of the show. And it's the part where he says, authority is brittle, oppression is the mask of fear. Remember that. And know this, the day will come where all these skirmishes and battles, these moments of defiance will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and there will be one too many. I am so excited for Andor season 2.
I'm so excited.
I know.
Oh, Nemik.
I know.
Oh, his manifesto. It's just we are going to be doing a revisiting Andor episode.
Soon.
Yes, it'll be out before Andor season 2 premieres. So it felt really perfect to be reading this book and then starting to gear up for a big Andor rewatch to then talk about on the podcast. Charlotte and I were talking about this. Sometimes I feel like I can't, like, if we're doing a Clone Wars episode that week, like, I can only be watching Clone Wars is the only Star Wars content I can watch that week. Like, I could not be reading Mask of Fear and be watching Clone Wars. It would just honestly mess with my brain.
Exactly.
Which feels a little silly to say, but that's how it happens, you know? But with the Mask of Fear and Andor, it really, like, they're so connected, I think, and will continue to be connected. And the themes in both of them go together so well that it's not going to hurt my brain to be in both of those stories at the same time.
No, not at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really excited for that. Also, the fact that we covered the Revenge of the Sith deleted scenes quite recently.
Right.
And we knew that they were going to come into play in this book in particular, but they really did. And there was just a weird synergy that is happening. I don't think we did that on purpose, but it happened. And it feels like this spring, late winter into spring, is really all about this time period. And I'm feeling it. It's great.
I'm feeling it too. These are some really heavy themes.
Yeah. So. It's a little too real, I have to be honest. And that's why this episode was supposed to come out last week. The book took us longer than we expected to get through. And I honestly think it's because it's a pretty heavy book and we just needed some more time. So thank you for bearing with us and getting those 2 Clone Wars episodes right in a row, but we're back with this one. So let's dive into it. So in part 1, we're going to talk about our first impressions of the book.
In part 2, we're going to talk about deeper themes and characters.
And in part 3, we're going to swap some of our quotes and react to them without knowing where the other is going. So that's kind of a all over the place pitch, but we're going to talk about some quotes from the book.
Yeah.
So without further ado, let's get started.
So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first?
All right, welcome to part 1, where we're talking all about first impressions. We've already commented that this book is kind of the perfect lead-in to Andor Season 2. also the perfect exit, I guess, from our discussion on the deleted scenes of Revenge of the Sith. We're going in such a good order here. Really,
it's so thematic.
It really
it's
does
great.
feel like some podcast synergy is happening. But
it's almost like that's what everyone's talking about in the fandom. Revenge of the Sith and Andor. Whoa, it's almost like that's why the book came out during this time period. So weird.
Before we start, full spoilers for the entire book. That I guess that kind of goes without saying, but I always feel like we need to say it. You know what I mean? But this book, we're following Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Saw Gerrera in the immediate aftermath of Order 66 and the establishment of Emperor Palpatine / the Empire, and kind of what everyone is doing in this time period, and kind of how the wheels haven't even really started turning on the rebellion yet, right? It's like everyone is kind of in shock from what happened, and it's about what they're going to do next, and kind of how they will all set off on these different paths throughout the book, and then how they will all come together at the end of it as well. I was really surprised by some of the paths, particularly that Bail Organa. We're going to be talking about him a lot, I feel like, throughout this discussion. But his character definitely surprised me the most, and was really kind of a pleasant surprise, because I think that Andor gave us such a great look into Mon Mothma in a way we really haven't seen yet. Of course, we've had her character in other instances through other Star Wars stories, but to have her be the main character, one of the main characters in Andor, was just, it was so fantastic. Genevieve O'Reilly is like incredible. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I feel like I knew who she was going into this book, and I think she did surprise me in the book, but I felt like I already knew.
They were reflective of what we had learned about her in season 1 of Andor, which when we started that show, I felt like I didn't know her at all.
Exactly.
And by the end of it, I was aware of what she was willing to risk. And like you said, in this book, a lot surprised me about her character, actually, but less so than Bail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I totally agree. And then as far as Saw Gerrera goes, he was actually in this way less than I thought. I honestly wouldn't even consider him a main character in the book. Very close to a main character, but his story was really like to kick us off with Sojin, one of the new characters that we'll be talking about. And I feel like he'll become a much bigger player throughout the rest of the trilogy. But I also think that's kind of how Saw Gerrera works, right? He's kind of like in the background making big moves that are going to have a big impact on everyone else. And I think it was kind of perfect, actually, because like I said, he is kind of always operating in the background and on his own. But then we see him, even though he hasn't necessarily been a main character throughout the book in the way that a character like Sojin or Bail or Mon was, he still ends up at the end of the book having that meeting with Bail and Mon Mothma that is going to kind of connect the three of them moving forward, and puts him in a position of power as well,
Yeah.
But I was kind of surprised, I gotta say, that he wasn't that kind of forward-facing main character.
I think Saw Gerrera is so interesting because obviously this is a character that was introduced in the Clone Wars. He had a big character, but not as big as his sister. And then when he came back in Rogue One, that was shocking, that sort of connection, right? And ever since then, I think Saw is a character who pops up intermittently. Like you said, he is sort of making moves in the background that are really big moves. And I feel like they can't do a ton with his character because I actually think they've defined some periods of his time that it's just that classic Star Wars book thing to me around they can only work with so much in the timeline. I think that when I say something like that, I think that might upset people, but I just think that's just part of the constraints of working on a Star Wars book that aren't necessarily constraints. Like when I say the word constraint, I don't mean that as a negative. It's just part of working with the characters that are on screen that pop up often that who knows how much knowledge even Alexander Freed had of where Andor season 2 will take us, that maybe we'll learn some more about Saw. In the very fact that Jyn Erso has a background that spans many years with Saw is also sort of a blocker, I guess, around his story. I don't know. I feel like I'm never expecting to hear a lot from Saw until we do in like one big scene, I guess. which we did in this at the very end.
Yeah.
I feel like that really underscored everything.
Yeah, I'm ready for him to take on a bigger role in these stories. Yeah, because he just is such an interesting character. And I think that he's been written so consistently across all of these different stories, from Clone Wars to Rogue One to Rebels, here in Mask of Fear. I just feel like the way that everyone has written his character of speech, his motivations, the way that he feels about the war and the Jedi and Andor. I don't know. It's always felt very consistent for me. And I can't say that about every Star Wars character. But I think everyone has done such a good job with his character that I'm ready for more from him. But as we kind of mentioned, Bail Organa was really the wild card, the surprise of this book. I was like, who is this? Who is this man that
I know
is quite literally running around the galaxy on what I think we can probably call a fool's errand, honestly, at this point in time. And that feels hard to say. And I think we'll be talking a lot about Bail, but I think that's where he ends up as well by the end of the book too.
Yeah, I wasn't sure, and I know we're going to talk more about him, but I just wasn't sure if I even really liked Bail that much in this book, at least in the first half, which is crazy because obviously I like Bail Organa as a character. Yeah. But I felt like the way that he was written, I don't know. I think that there's a fascinating way in Andor and then again in this book that we see our main players and even our secondary players approach the concept of rebellion. I don't even think the word rebellion is used in this book, but just different ways of defying what sort of fascism is happening to each and everyone at this time period. Everyone is responding differently, and Mon learns that very, very much when she's trying to get the votes for her bill. But I just find it fascinating, this exploration of different reactions, I guess, to different government stipulations, and how the way this book was written, it just makes you feel pretty sympathetic towards everyone's side.
Yeah.
And understanding. Sympathetic is a strong word, but understanding of where everyone's coming from. We have all these different planets that have dealt with their own histories. And Alexander Freed is so good at explaining all those and broadening the galaxy and all these intricate alien species and how their own histories are intertwined with separatist concepts. It's absolutely fascinating, and it just makes you it just broadens everything, broadens your entire worldview, and that's a major triumph of this book.
I agree. It really made me ready to see Bail Organa in Andor season 2.
Do you think that's going to happen?
I really hope so. I really hope so.
I almost don't think it's going to because of the fact that he's such a big character in this.
But Saw is in Andor season 2.
I know.
And
listen,
and
I
so
agree.
is Mon Mothma.
I agree. And Bail was in Rogue One. So
yes, and he was recently in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. Like, I think it would be so.
Wasn't it so surprising though with Andor season 1 that he wasn't there?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I don't know.
He was in the Bad Batch,
Sure.
And so was Saw Gerrera. Saw Gerrera was also in the Bad Batch. So
I'm telling you, just pops up, makes these big moves.
He does. He does. I just think this book gave such, you talked about like sympathy for characters and stuff and understanding of their points of view. And it's funny because Bail was the person that I felt like I was shaking throughout the entire book. Like, everyone else is right, Bail. I need you to slow down and think.
I know. The entire time I was like, can you just go home? Like, your reaction to the trauma that you and everyone has experienced, but him in particular having this weird insight into hanging out with the Jedi during the fall of the Republic and like the death of Padme. And
hanging out with the Jedi.
Hanging out. I mean, hanging out so casual. Seeking refuge.
Going on.
Sorry, I didn't use big words. At the very end, though, I feel like it's not random for us as Star Wars fans to see Bail there, right? But it is.
But it is kind of random.
It is kind of random,
yeah.
And so then he experienced that. He's the only one that experiences that. So of course he's having this crazy reaction around his own bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, you just adopted a daughter. Everyone for some reason knows about that, which is also crazy. And I'm like, you need to relax. Please, please. Oh my God.
for everything, literally
For
the sake of
everything.
everything. Yeah, I totally agree. But before we get further into the conversation, we've already kind of talked about how we felt this book was really heavy, but I wanted to bring back one of the quotes from George Lucas that we also discussed in the Revenge of the Sith commentary, because I
The
feel
synergy.
like, I mean, it's synergizing, right?
Mhm,
Where he's talking about the politics of Star Wars, and it feels very pertinent to both the real world, but also to the Mask of Fear in particular. This is the back half of the quote, so it's not the entire quote. But
if you're interested in the full quote, we do have a reel that is making the rounds on Instagram.
On Instagram, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's titled like George Lucas on the Politics of Star Wars or something.
Yep.
So this is the back half of the quote. And George says, we in modern 20th century, it was very much a banana republic reality. And he's talking about like how societies and democracies get taken over, whether by coups or by being handed over. So he says, we in modern 20th century, it was very much a banana republic reality where a general takes over and does it by force. But it's more interesting when it's actually given over to kind of compensate for the fact that the elected representatives can't agree on anything and are corrupt. And therefore, in order to clean up the mess, somebody is allowed to come in and fix things. And this is what's happening throughout. I mean, the plot of the whole book is getting a bill to pass. And it takes Mon Mothma so much effort to coordinate with all of these people and all of these coalitions to just present her case, really, and why this is a good thing. And then by the end of it, it doesn't even matter. And it was such a great thread to watch throughout the book, to see how like the Senate was operating at this time, bringing back in the separatists, how that was being received by the people of the galaxy. And the whole time I was wondering, okay, is this bill going to pass? Like
I know.
what does it mean if it passes? Because we know things are only going to get worse. And then of course she hears about Palpatine's century plan from Masamada, and it is like chilling. That whole scene at the very end is just,
You know what's so chilling about that scene too? I think that the rug getting pulled up from under us during that scene was really perfect. But
yeah.
the way that Masamita was like, the Emperor sees the value of arguments and people who are against him. And I'm like, do you remember that quote? It was just fascinating about that. That was just fascinating to me because it really just was a great underlining of how Palpatine still wants to play the charade of some sort of, for the people government, even though that's clearly not how things operate.
Yeah.
He sees the value of dissension, even if it doesn't even matter. It's like all a play.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other part of that conversation too, when he said Palpatine doesn't care about tomorrow. He'll leave that to people like me and you. He's thinking about the century plan. Like the day-to-day nonsense that you're trifling with right now is literally inconsequential. And then at the end of their conversation, when Mon says, does he actually even care at all about like peace and order and security? And he says, oh, I've never thought to ask him.
Ugh.
And oh my gosh, I got to be honest, when that scene started in the book, I thought, I was like, are we going to the Death Star?
Yeah.
Which I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about that, honestly.
Well, we're not. We can't because it's not. We're so far from it being constructed. But yeah, I totally understand.
It started, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it started. I mean, we see it at the end of Revenge of the Sith, but like it's just an exoskeleton.
Yeah, but I thought the way he takes her to the construction site of the prison, I feel like I almost thought he was going to take her to the construction of the Death Star, but that would make sense. Now I'm thinking it through. I'm like, that it's the big secret, so that wouldn't make sense anyway.
No, but I think it's valuable to point out though that there are, like, while we think about as Star Wars fans, the Death Star as the ultimate evil. And it is.
Yeah.
It is the biggest set piece. The fact that this book, which will have 3, in this series, will have 3 books, now has different forms of like smaller, lesser evils as new set pieces to show their control. I think we saw that already with like the prisons and everything in Andor as well. But even just beginning to see that here, like there's a scene in Andor when Cassian is talking to, like, it's when he meets Nemec and they're by the fire, and cousin from the bear is is like, oh, where were you? And he has all these tattoos, and they're trading conversations about what sort of internment camp they were in. And so I think that this is this is the beginning of that, or similar beginnings of that, right? Where that was being defined in Andor. It's not really being, it was been defined elsewhere, but having that as a piece where I think Cassian says he was in like SIPO or something.
Yeah.
I don't know why I remember that. Anyway, I think this is a similar, the point is that there's smaller evils everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're going to be building and building until they are where they are in A New Hope and everything like that. I also want to mention here, I guess at the beginning too, and kind of when we're thinking about like the big picture of the book, how in the big picture of the book, who wasn't in the book of Palpatine. And I thought that was such a great choice that we don't hear any speeches from him. That was something I also thought might happen with Mon Mothma at the end, that she might be taken to Palpatine. I thought it might be this like reveal where he has a conversation with her or something like that. But no, he's not in it at all in that sense. And I'll be really curious to see if and how he does pop up in the other 2 books. But I thought it was a great choice to not have him because, like they talk about, he's not interested in the day-to-day. He's not concerned with all of these small efforts that people like Mon Mothma are putting through. He's concerned with the century plan, the contingency plan, all of that. But like Nemec says, soon it'll be one too many. And he's going to be caught unawares.
Yes.
Yeah. What did you think about Palpatine not being in the book?
I kept wondering if we were going to see him speak. And it just made me think a lot around, I know we've seen him have a speech in The Bad Batch.
Yeah.
So I guess that's something that we're aware of. But I think that Palpatine will be increasingly not seen throughout the Empire's reign, just based off of his looks. And I think it's somehow he will find it to his advantage to be mysterious and have people acting for him. So I wasn't that surprised that we didn't see him. I felt like it was another form of his invisible power.
Yeah.
I think eventually we probably will get a scene of him in these 3 books, but it might only be one time.
Interesting. I think that will be something to definitely look out for. Like, what are these authors choosing to, when are they choosing to put Palpatine into play?
Yeah, I think it was really important for Palpatine to be in The Bad Batch because if I remember correctly, it's been a while, that whole speech was about the like offloading of clones.
The destruction of Camino.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it was really important to underscore how that was a big change that was happening from the past to the future. And it was really obviously destructive, right? So I guess there has to be something, Palpatine has to be used sparingly, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it'll be something similar to that.
Yeah. You saying that is interesting because it's really reminding me of our Clone Wars discussions.
I know. I was just thinking that too.
Yeah. If you're not listening, we're doing a big Clone Wars rewatch where we're going through all the arcs. And in those discussions, we're going back to like original fan responses on the Jedi Council forums and what they thought of the Clone Wars episodes when they came out in real time. And a comment that gets brought up a number of times, especially in like season 1 of the Clone Wars, is about if the Clone Wars should be using a character like Palpatine more sparingly. Like they were worried that he was in these episodes too much and throughout the show too much. And you and I I've talked about this now a couple of times, but the point in the Clone Wars is that, we need to see his relationship with Anakin and how all of that is going to evolve. But then in a story like this, I think you're right that it's important for him to be used sparingly, and how that really contributes to like the evilness of what he's doing, and also the way that he can distance himself too from like people like Mon Mothma and what's happening and what she's trying to do and where she's eventually going to go.
Yeah, another reason, just to expand a little bit for people who aren't listening to our Clone Wars discussion, another reason to use Palpatine is to show not only his relationship with Anakin, but also the relationship with the Jedi Order as a whole, so that this whole conflict, which is a big conflict in the Mask of Fear around the Jedi framing Palpatine and the opposite, right? I feel like this conflict between Palpatine and the Jedi is so key to Bail Organa, but we see that throughout the Clone Wars as well, and how that is built upon that the trust or lack thereof that between someone like Palpatine and Mace Windu. Yeah, so that's why it's being used there. So yeah, I'm totally on the same page with you. Let's put a pin in it for book 2 and 3.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about our new characters. What were our first impressions of someone like Sojin, Haki, Kemish, Kamara, some of those players?
Okay, so I have a favorite, and that's Haki.
I do like Haki a lot, yeah.
Haki. I feel like I really liked that she was older. And I found myself not fully tracing and understanding her motivations, but then by the end of the book, I decided I was fine with that because she lived, and it's clear that she's going to be a character throughout at least the second book too.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued to see where that goes. I felt similarly around the motivations with Kemish. I wasn't sure what I thought about their motivations. And I really liked Sujin as a character, especially by the end, where I kept going back and forth about whether I understood his own motivations and felt sympathy, and also then was like, oh, when they called him a terrorist, I was like, do I agree with that? I was going back and forth, and I felt like a lot of what I was experiencing reading this book with literally all of our characters was I was experiencing doubt throughout about everything that everyone was doing. And that's because the characters themselves were also experiencing that to different extents. And I think that what this book did so well is really craft that narrative around, am I doing this? What are the reasons I'm doing this? Do I have a clear mind? Can I firmly say that this is exactly what I believe? How does this go in line with my values, my history, my heritage? And if it doesn't, what do I even stand for? What's our purpose? Where are we going? It was a lot of ethical, moral questions were being thrown around. And I found myself feeling that way around, honestly, all of our new characters as well. But I really liked Haki. And I really liked the conversations that she and Bail had, especially when they were alone. Yeah. What about you? What did you think?
Yeah, I liked them. I think I have the same response. Like, Haki is my favorite, I think. I really liked Sojin, and I'm excited to talk about Sojin and Bail in the next part, because I don't think I realized how many similarities they had until I was going back and like working on our notes, right? I feel like I wasn't as like keyed into it, and then I was going back and like really paying attention to what I had highlighted, and I was like, girl.
Interesting.
Kamara, who is part of Saw Gerrera's group, she didn't have a huge role in this book, but I kind of am hoping she does in the next one, because I think she gets one of the last chapters or something like that, kind of within Saw's world of that POV. And I think her and Sojin had like a very interesting relationship as far as like what they told each other, how they were just kind of talking to each other about what was going on. And I guess really even more their thoughts about each other, because they didn't share that much like screen time, if you will.
Yeah.
But I think she could be a really interesting character to watch moving forward, to see where she ends up, because I think she has some interesting things to say about Saw Gerrera here in the beginning. And the fact that she was like a journalist or like a political reporter or something like that prior to all of this, I thought was so great. And I would like to see more of that. And I think she even mentions at one point in the book, like, one day I'll ask like the journalistic questions about what's going on, but I can't do it today, or like something like that.
Right.
Yeah. But I think to your point about like all of these characters kind of doubting where they stood, I think that's like you said, that's like I feel like a huge theme of the book, because everyone is waking up to a new reality where their moral standing was based on like what side they were on with the Republic and the Separatists, to like kind of make it kind of black and white like that. And now neither of those things exist. So it's like, okay, where do you put your stake in things at this point? And how do I define what's good now? If, like, for example, all the Separatists are coming back into the Senate, when for years now they've been the big bad, and we've been the big bad to them, and now we're supposed to welcome them back with open arms. And
the reintegration whole thing was fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think that has actually been something I've been wondering about a lot with watching the Clone Wars.
Yeah.
And even thinking through just the machinations of the Clone Wars, and how from like at a larger scale, you all know it's a little bit of a farce, or a lot of a farce, around this sort of quote unquote fake war. But then these are real people, these are real planets that have real opinions and real histories, like I was just talking about. And then once the Empire comes into play, then what happens? And so I'm so happy that was discussed in this book. There was protests and people upset, and I felt like that was very real. And I just felt like Alexander Free did a really good job of highlighting exactly those differences and, I guess, struggles that would come from that experience.
Those complexities, yeah. And even the fact that Mon Mothma needs their large voting bloc in order to get the Imperial Rebirth Act passed. So now she's spent like all these years kind of lobbying against them. And now she has to go, and it does not go well initially. I really liked Nuvolio too. I should have added him to the list, but I really liked his character as well. And when they have their, oh my God, but let's talk about the way that he signals Mon Mothma, where she gets the message on her arm in a rash. Right. I was like, this is kind of like some Harry Potter stuff. Like, kind of crazy.
Novolio sounds like Marvolo.
Oh my God,
riddle.
It does.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking the whole time.
I was like, that is when she was like, oh, I got brushed by someone. Then I had a rash. Then the rash became words, and then it like melted out of my skin.
Away. It's like, so interesting. It's both Potter, it's also Mission Impossible-ish. It's also sort of James Bond-y. It's very spy, but it's also sort of magical. It like really worked.
It worked to be magical in the sense that everything is automated, and like they're being watched. There's surveillance on all of these characters, and they all know it. And then we have a character like Mon Mothma who is seeking surveillance on her allies as well, like Lud. Great character too, and Bail Organa and other people as well. But when she meets Nuvolio for the first time and she's like put on trial, I was like, man, he is saying some
I loved that chapter.
Things to her. Yeah. Really, it was intense. And I thought it was great to kind of see Mon Mothma put to the test, honestly.
She was my favorite character in the book. I love reading her thoughts and her conflict, and it just felt so real.
Kind of before we start diving into deeper themes, though, I guess like on Sojin specifically, I think I'm still a little confused at like where he came from. Like I understand that he came from the Separatists and they had him as kind of this agent on ice, a sleeper agent put on ice, but I was kind of fascinated that he was put on ice throughout the end of the war. To me, it almost sounded like he missed the majority of the war, and all of his work had kind of been before the Clone Wars actually started, or perhaps in the very beginning. So I think is still a little confusing to me, but I really enjoyed his character, and I'm kind of sad that he's gone.
Me too. I was really looking forward to seeing how they were going to do everything about bringing him to trial and show. Like I was really, I don't know, I was while they were pitching that, I was like, this is not going to happen, because what happens then when it does happen? And then, but I was like, all right, well, I guess we'll see. There's 3 books. And then it didn't happen. Yeah. I'm with you about the not really understanding his origins. I feel like I missed like a crucial paragraph or something
Right, yeah.
around that, which happens sometimes with Star Wars books, because there's just a lot being thrown at you. New names, new planets, new cultures. And it's hard to retain, I guess, when it's hard to like zero in on what's actually important and what's not, at least in the beginning. I found, like, even when you were just talking, I guess Sujin is sort of a similar character to like an Echo in the Clone Wars, The Bad Batch, as someone who had a lot of information in his head, right? But I guess it's sort of like a darker Echo version. Yeah. I guess that's the only analogy I have for that. I think it was really cool the way that this book was divided up in terms of the dawn, the day, the night, all the different parts. I really liked that. And it just reminded me around how Coruscant has an artificial daylight and artificial nighttime. And so there's an element of control around all of that. That is sort of intrinsic in the planet's design. They actually go into that a lot in the Revenge of the Sith novelization. And I've always thought that was really interesting. And I thought about that when the divisions about the different parts came up.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about too. And even the fact that we start at dawn, light is breaking on this brand new world that they all live in now with the Galactic Empire. And as we've mentioned, a very heavy book, right? So like the day starts with the funeral of a Jedi on Jedha, and then we end with Mon Mothma and Perrin at night. But it's really about Mon Mothma and how she's kind of like, her fear is the only thing that she's really certain about by the end of the book. So definitely feels like the middle of the night Sunday scaries kind of thing.
Mood. Except a little more serious.
On a galactic scale. Yeah. They're just hanging out. Yeah.
They're just hanging out.
They're just hanging out with their Sunday scaries.
Again. Let's talk about the deeper themes, I think.
Go. Yeah.
Okay, so welcome to part 2, where we're discussing deeper themes and characters. I need to hear about the comparisons between Sojin and Bail that you found.
When I started on our notes for this, one thing that I found myself that I kept highlighting throughout the book, which, by the way, we are annotators of books directly in the book. I know this is controversial, and if you need to stop listening, I fully understand, but that's who we are.
I'm also a major dog earer, where I like on both the top of the page and the bottom of the page.
Oh, I didn't know about the bottom of the page.
Always at the bottom of the page, and then I'll go through and I'll go back and highlight if I don't have something with me.
Okay.
But yeah.
Okay. Nice.
That's me.
I'm gonna try the bottom dog ear. I've only ever done the top. Yeah. But I was so surprised throughout this book how many times ghosts are mentioned. And perhaps this is not the theme you would have expected us to start on in this section, maybe like politics, morality, the ethics of what these people are doing. But I want to talk about ghosts because it came up so many times. And I didn't notice initially that we have 2 chapters. We have the haunting of Bail Organa and the haunting of Sojin Vaknalis.
Back to back.
Back to back. And I didn't notice that these were the same chapter titles until later. I had noted Sojin's, the haunting of Sojin, because I thought the fact that he's kind of like this bionic man and he's having like almost like hallucinations, and he, especially like once he's on the run in Coruscant, when he goes into that bar and he kind of for lack of a better word, kind of like crashes out, and he's having like visions of when he was on the battlefield, of his family and the different clans and like the doctor who made him and stuff like that. And he talks a lot about how he is haunted by the ghosts of the planet, which we'll also talk about, of Io Dajarets. And as they're moving through that planet, it's like all the old comms are still getting like phantom radio transmissions effectively. And they know that everyone else turns off their comms because I guess it's like creeping them out. But Sojin's are implanted, so he can't. So he's constantly hearing these ghosts, as he calls them. And he talks about how he can't do certain things in front of the ghosts and how he doesn't want to talk about certain things in front of the ghosts. And then we have Bail Organa, who is also talking about the Jedi as ghosts and how they are haunting him as well. In the very beginning of the book on page 4, Bail, when he's at the funeral, it says, Bail was tempted to join the chorus, but his was not a hollowing grief, not a grief of helplessness, absent of responsibility. If he called out, his ghosts would hear, and the haunting would resume. And as I mentioned, Sojin talks a lot about ghosts. Let me find the quote, but he also describes himself as a ghost. He says, "I am a ghost raised to haunt the living." And I think this is such a fascinating connection between the two of them because, like, what is the purpose of having both of these men who, one is a contingency plan from the separatists, one was a Republic senator who is obsessed with the Jedi and their legacy. Sojin kind of can't tell fact from fiction once he gets to a certain point in the book. And he even comments at one point that, like, he's not sure if what is going on in his mind is data or memories, like data that's been implanted into him or memories of his past. And like, what is it about these two characters that makes them prone to believing in ghosts, to having these thoughts about ghosts? Because Mon Mothma's not doing it. Saw Gerrera's not doing it. Kemish and Haki aren't doing it. And I wonder if it's something about like being stuck in the past, what you were talking about earlier, Charlotte, of like asking in a way like what is real, a memory or a distortion. And I think Bail kind of goes through this at certain points with like how he remembers what happens in Order 66. But I thought this was such an interesting thing to connect these two characters.
Yeah, I feel like it absolutely is. And you can almost turn to any page and probably find a mention of ghosts on it. I was literally just doing it and I noticed that a lot of the pages mention ghosts.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things, right? I think something that you said, that Sujin is part of a sort of separatist contingency plan, and then he has sort of doubts about what's implanted and what's real, and then Bail also has those sort of doubts, right, around his memories with the Jedi, the children, the fact that he saw the Jet Lucas Jedi cut down clones, and what does he think about that? Then when he was hanging out with Yoda and Obi-Wan, what he learned, like, are those like, what happened? Was that real? He looks at Leia, he sees Padme. Padme is haunting every decision and is the reason why Bail and Mon can't agree until the very end, right? And that is said by Mon Mothma, that is said by Bail in each of their heads around, if only Padme could have helped us sort out our differences here. I think also we should probably look at the quote from Luthen, the amazing monologue that he gives in Andor, where he says, "I share my dreams with ghosts."
Yeah.
I think that since the title is from Andor, then we should also think that how the theme of sharing my dreams and ghosts, I made my mind a sunless space. I feel like there are, I don't know, the concept of the dead, it's so recent for all these people.
Yeah.
The past is yesterday. What they were working for years and years and years is gone forever for both of them. And yeah, so there's just a lot of mourning happening. And the way that you deal with that mourning, I guess, is personifying those feelings. And I think that comes through in the ghosts.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it about, like, obviously the ghosts are representative of the dead, and the dead are like not even buried yet, kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like, there's a quote too that's like, the past is not the past, it's not even past yet.
Yeah.
And I think that's what they're all living in. And Sojin has this like what's the word? Like, not like vertigo, but like being woken up into this world that is so completely different when like he has kind of a data-driven purpose implanted into him and now it's gone, can really mess with your sense of reality too. And then Bail going through what he went through has also just kind of plunged him into grief. And Bail really treats the Jedi like a religion in this book, which I found really interesting too, because we talk about the Jedi as a religion, like the Force is like akin to like God, for example. But for Bail, it was the Jedi themselves, not even the Force. And there's one point where he's praying to the Jedi for guidance, and he's hoping that Mace Windu and Shaak Ti will have something.
And Plo Koon, like what about the wisdom of Plo Koon? I'm like,
to
this
give
is
to him.
Kind of weird.
It's weird. And he even says, I didn't really know them.
Yeah, it's this obsession.
Yeah. And I loved too that Sojin is really haunted by the ghost of Io Dajarets, and then for Bail, it's the Jedi. And at one point, Bail prays, "Give me strength," he thought, hoping the ghosts of the Jedi would hear him over the wraiths of Io Dajarets. Like these ghosts are like in combat with one another to say something on this haunted planet, if you will. Just really fascinating stuff, I think. And I really also hadn't noticed that Bail's story begins and ends with the ghosts of the Jedi. Like I mentioned that one on page 4, if he called out, the ghosts would hear and the haunting would resume. And kind of one of his last scenes is when he lets go of the Jedi. And it says, Brea needed Bail, and Leia needed Bail, and the ghost would linger forever if he allowed it. The ghost he'd given himself over to and nearly died for. The ghost he feared would come for Leia, but she was his daughter, not theirs. And then a little later it says, Bail loved the Jedi. If he was haunted by them, it was because he cried out to their ghosts, because he strived to emulate their clarity and endurance, their faith that one brave soul, guided by the Force, could set the galaxy right. It was the wish of a child, carried with him since childhood, and it would shackle him forever if he didn't act. We'll talk about this too, but Bail really goes through, I think, like the most change throughout the book, character change. But I found the hauntings throughout just something I wouldn't have really expected in this book, honestly.
Yeah, fully. Let's talk a little bit about the Jedi, or a lot about the Jedi.
We talk about this all the time on the show, but what happened to turn the galaxy against the Jedi? And we know, obviously, that Palpatine has his speech in Revenge of the Sith that, they plotted to kill me, they were evil, blah, 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 blah. But, like, how often are people actually believing this? Like, how is this really reaching the galaxy at large when there were thousands of Jedi Knights, right? Like, do the people really believe that the thousands of Jedi Knights were corrupt? Like, how was that happening? And here we find out that there are a bunch of forged recordings, documents, if you will, proving that the Jedi Council had it out for Palpatine. And not only that, these forged recordings also include that the Jedi are going to use the younglings and the Padawans in this endeavor too. So everyone is guilty here.
I found that scene so interesting. I was like, this is it. This is what we've been talking about forever. But then what was crazy is that, so there's Bail is discovering this and watching the recordings. He is not super surprised by them because he's like, I've seen propaganda. Propaganda is everywhere. But for me, I was like, oh my God, this one woman talking about how she didn't want the Jedi taking away her baby, and how the Jedi promised her something. And I can't remember the specifics, but regardless, I was watching that like, oh my God, Caitlin, we just talked about this with the Holocron heist and the situation about what happens with the kids that are taken from in Holocron heist and Children of the Force, this episode of the Clone Wars. Palpatine kidnaps children in order to experiment on them. Eventually this experimentation, it comes into play in The Mandalorian. And there's this big debate around the fact that the Jedi don't return the children to their parents.
Wild. And literally insane.
And we don't see that happen in the episode. We just, I guess, assume that now these babies will go live in the Jedi Temple. And instead, but we literally watch them be snatched away from their parents by assassins and people who are opposing Cad Bane, literally Cad Bane. And it we were talking about how it might be easy for them to play, I guess, into the public around that narrative because we find that to be extremely problematic. So them having propaganda around that, I was like, wait, is this real? Could this be real? And so then the audience, was reading this like having my own set of doubts around what we were witnessing. And I was like, okay, maybe there's 3 pieces of propaganda that they watched. And I was like, okay, so the 2 and 3 are definitely forged, but I wonder if 1 is real. I don't know. They said it wasn't. It wasn't real, but I was finding myself flip-flopping just based off of what we know about the Jedi. And the very fact that we were able to do that just really plays into the theme around biases and the way that we view pieces of history. And it's so easy to see how the narrative can totally change so quickly within days of the Empire Rising.
Yeah, and even those recordings that Bail watches in the very beginning of the book, when it's like Yoda and I don't know, some other Jedi, but Yoda's there, and they're talking about how
they're hanging out.
They're hanging out. They're having a kiki. And they're talking about bringing in the Padawans. And one of the other Jedi says like, oh, they're so young or something like that. And someone else is like, it'll be fine. We need them to like, they'll definitely be following what their masters are saying. And we need that for the future and everything like that. And the first time I read it, I assumed it was real. And I was like, this just feels so wrong, even though this, like the way that the conversation went felt so wrong, even though that is what happened. The Jedi put in Padawans and younglings into the war because they had to. So all of that is true, but the framing of it is so powerful, and not really knowing exactly what is false in the propaganda. I mean, that's propaganda, you know what I mean? And yeah, I just thought that the whole presentation of like Bail's whole mission of proving that these things were a forgery, and then being told at every turn, like, it does not matter because the people have moved on. For better or for worse, they have moved on. They're looking for stability right now. That's what we need. And Mon Mothma at the end, when they have like another argument about it, and she's like, if we do this, everything will be viewed through the Jedi lens of the Jedi. And that is not going to help us. It's unfortunate, but it's not going to help us in the long run. And I thought that was, it was like hard to read. And even though I needed Bail to move on, you know what I mean? It was still hard to read that because we know that the Jedi are still being hunted at this time. We know that they were good people. We know that they were flawed. And I think that Mon Mothma gives Sojin actually this like whole diatribe about the Jedi at the end of the book. And I was like, I just need to pull this anytime we need to talk about the complexities of the Jedi because it's here, I want to read the very end of it, not her whole speech. It was very good, but the very end of it where she said, they were good and they were ordinary. They were fallible, and even the most smug and arrogant were trying to hew a tradition older than the Republic. They deserved better than to die at the hands of a power-hungry old man who saw them as a threat. We deserve better than to lose another people, another religion from the universe. And I think that really does kind of sum up the Jedi. She said a lot of other good things in her speech, but I think she had a good summary of events. And Bail gets there as well. He realizes that this is, like I said, a fool's errand to try and prove the Jedi were innocent. He says, truth matters. The Jedi matter. And everyone is like, no, they don't anymore. Unfortunately, they don't.
And it's funny because I think you can zoom out and know that right now is not the time for the Jedi. That comes later.
Yeah.
In the history of the galaxy.
Yeah.
But it's like you said, it is hard to hear because you know that they are heroes. They are on the side of the good. They were manipulated by the dark side. And at least there's one person who is fighting for them, but it's fruitless.
Yeah. Yeah. There's another point too where Bail says we can't let the Jedi slip out of the public eye and no one else is talking about them. I need to stay on message. And Mon Mothma is standing there like, no, that's not the message you need to be standing on. There was a quote from Sojin actually that I thought would be good to talk about here. I think it's in his introductory chapter where he says, what surprised Sojin most was how quickly the war had ended, that and the Jedi. But the Jedi had never been important in the grand scheme of things. Is this true?
No, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true at all. I think that really plays into the unreliable narrator of Sujin.
Mm-hmm.
Unreliable narrator is a bit like word that's thrown around too much, but because he's not necessarily a narrator either, but he is sort of an unreliable character for sure. And his perspective isn't necessarily the quote unquote right one. Mm-hmm. I still think that who's our moral compass in this book? I think it's Mon Mothma. Secondary is Bail Organa, but we know that Bail is plagued by ghosts, he's manic. Yeah. Bail is manic. One thing I wanted to just, before we move on too far, Mon's diatribe on the Jedi that she says to Sujin, where you just read that, and she ends it with, we deserve better than to lose another religion from this universe. I think Io de Juris is super cool. It's what a cool planet, the city planet, the fact that it had so much history, these old ruins, and now they're gone. They're ruined, flooded, and destroyed. And Mon talks a lot about how she wished she didn't rush back to Coruscant or Chandrila, I can't remember, when she was there working on a bill a long time ago. Wish she stayed and did the cultural tour and observed the history a little bit more. Io de Juris, I think, serves as a really good set piece as to be representative of a couple things like the history, the cultural institutions, and also can be very similar to the history of the Jedi. It's gone, unfortunately. It's a tragedy, and by the destruction of this extremely cool place with so much history, it's another thing that they can mourn. It's a recent thing that they can mourn, but just as quickly as it happens, they are all moving on. They figure out who was there and everyone is moving on. And that's sort of the same situation that we're dealing with the Jedi. They're gone. They've been exterminated, and that's just how it is. And now we're moving on. And it's terrible. And I like the fact that Mon underscores this about the Jedi, because I think the same can be said about this ancient civilization.
Yeah, I freaking love the introduction, obviously, of Io de Juris. Yeah. I think it's so cool. The fact that it's older, it was a lost civilization, presumably in the era of the High Republic, like phase 2, at least. I think it's so cool. And I think there are a couple things happening, like when we're thinking about, I guess, like the big themes of this book and perhaps where the trilogy is going, and remembering that we're in a really dark time period, right? Like this book does not end in a hopeful place at all. This idea of like civilization being lost, being forgotten, peoples being forgotten, destroyed is kind of peppered around in so many places throughout. Like Io de Juris itself, the fact that its history is kind of unknown in a lot of ways, that there are archaeologists, but what they know about the planet seems quite limited. I think they mentioned that they don't even know. Yeah, it says Io de Juris had been dead when the Republic was young, and even the name and nature of its constructors were lost. And like no one really knows how it was built, why it was left behind, anything like that. And we've come to the same place with the Jedi in a lot of ways, and the government of the Republic as well, that will all be gone too. And then something similar is kind of happening at the same time with the clones as well, which is a story we see explored in the Bad Batch about what is going to happen to all of them. I'm also going to bring us to like a specific place in the book too that I think goes along with this, but Sojin's destruct orders, I think, have a bigger meaning for this trilogy and maybe just this book as well. His destruction orders that Mon Mothma, or that Nuvolio gives to Mon Mothma, are oubliette and sublime, which when I read those the first time, I was like, okay, All right.
I know, same.
You do you.
Uh-huh.
So oubliette is from the French oublier, which means to forget. But an oubliette specifically is a basement room or a dungeon, which is only accessible from a hatch, a hole, or like the ceiling, basically from above.
Mm-hmm.
And then sublime, I put in the definition, is lofty, grand, or exalted in thought, expression, or manners of outstanding spiritual, intellectual, or moral wealth. And that is the word that's used to kill Sojin.
Mm-hmm.
Outstanding, intellectual, or moral worth. And I was like, there's something happening here with these words, and it was like the more
that's him. That's him.
That's him, but it's not Sojin specifically, it's the separatists. It's someone like Nuvolio and the people who created him, that to destroy him, oubliette, he's kind of trapped in a dungeon in a lot of ways. With his implants, he gave himself to the separatists when they came to his clan because there were no other options, and he was promised help for his people that wasn't ultimately given, and he was trapped in that forever. And so by destroying him, they're forgetting him, but then they're also destroying, like, I guess perhaps the moral worth or the intellectual worth about the separatist goals that were destroyed or forgotten with Sojin's death, because he was the contingency plan for the separatists.
Mm-hmm.
But now, and Mon's the one that says those words. She's the one that signs his death warrant, right?
Yep.
That destroys him. And a part of her is lost in that moment too. And she dwells on that a lot throughout the end of the book, that now she's a murderer. She feels like a hypocrite. Is she really a pacifist anymore? And then on a larger scale in the book, in the galaxy, these lofty ideals of politics, of the Republic, of the Jedi, all of those are destroyed and forgotten as well. And I'm kind of obsessed with these word choices here. I think we should put a pin in them for the rest of the trilogy.
No, it's so good. I'm so glad that you pointed that out.
Yeah.
And I think the concept of forgetting, but then also an accessible basement, like putting something away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just fascinating.
Yeah, I
love
think
that you pointed this out.
I think that's a good component to it as well, that you could put something away as well, and it can be accessed again later.
Mm-hmm. But barely.
Yeah, barely. If someone knows where it is, because a basement dungeon that's only accessible from above.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. Okay, let's continue with Sojin though. Should Mon have helped Sojin kill Palpatine?
No. That was never going to happen.
I wanted it. I knew it obviously wasn't going to happen, but I wanted to see how far he would get and what Mon Mothma would do.
Yeah, I think that just Mon is not there yet. We're not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with you, of course. I want Sujin to get as far as he possibly can to kill Palpatine. But I think when he said that, I was like, all right, we're taking it a little far, because I know as an audience member, like, that's not happening.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. And Mon is threading a very fine line in Andor. She has her different resources and different people that she contacts, and everything is very to a decorum. With that knowledge and knowing that Sujin wanted to kill Palpatine, that was never going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Of course, I would love to see how far he would have gotten. This is the same thing about, like, me wanting to see what would have happened if Bail used Sujin to show the forgery and everything. It was just, I did not see a way for that to work in this book.
Yeah, no, it wasn't going to happen. What's interesting about the scene is that Mon Mothma is, like, morally against murdering Palpatine. Mm-hmm. That's her holdup, which I think you're right that we're going to have to see this change by the end. And her being morally against killing Palpatine means that she ends up killing Sojin, which is also against her morals. And it makes it, now she feels like a hypocrite, right?
And now she has a piece of shrapnel in her heart. It is fascinating. We deal with this so often in Star Wars about people who have cybernetic implants and different arms and robot arms and different pieces of their body that they use it for moral reasonings, right? But it's not, I think in the original Star Wars, it was like if you're half robot, there's like more machine now than man, right? That's the whole thing. But it gets more complicated, I think, when we have these quote unquote good characters like Mon Mothma and Bail Organa too, having an artificial heart. And I don't know. I feel like I'm not explaining this well, but I think that Mon reflecting on the fact that she has a piece of shrapnel almost impounding her heart, her soul, like where that only happened because she pulled the trigger, right?
Yeah. She said sublime.
She said sublime.
Her moral worth.
Yeah. And so now she has a piece of like a foreign body in her heart, getting closer and closer to stabbing her heart, her soul, because she did this awful act of killing somebody. So I find that interesting. And she reflects on that. She's like, I'm different now, because now her everything about her, herself, her body, her being is different after experiencing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it is. Okay, I think talking about Mon Mothma and the way she puts her own morals on the line when it comes to like, who should I murder, Palpatine or Sojin in this moment? I think we can talk a little bit about like, honestly, what's a big part of this book is like the ethics of what is going on in the Senate and what people are willing to do, what they're willing to sign their name onto with Mon Mothma and the rebirth bill, and what it all means for these planets, for the people of the galaxy, and how they're going to move forward. And everyone has a different opinion, but I think what we see as a common thread throughout all of them is what people care about is stability. And that is what the Empire, what the Emperor is offering to the galaxy right now. And for a lot of these senators, even if they don't agree with what Palpatine is saying or doing necessarily, it's what the people are saying they want, of the stability of not being in the Clone Wars. So isn't it their duty to give that to them? One of the senators in one of the conversations with Mon Mothma says, the people have spoken. What does it matter if I believe they are wrong when I am their sworn servant? Is it not the truest act of democracy to trust the public will? And this gets brought up by a couple of different senators, both on like the separatist side and I guess like the Republic side.
Imperial side,
I guess. Yeah, the Imperial side. When Mon Mothma is kind of making her rounds. And I think even a character like Ludd struggles with that at the end. Like we don't even actually see how he ends up voting on the bill. But I think he knows that Mon Mothma is right, but I don't think that his constituents would want him to vote against the bill. And one of his aides is kind of talking to him about that at the end. And even Haki, in one of her arguments with Bail, is telling him when she is also trying to snap him out of this chase for justice for the Jedi, she tells him that his job is to give Leia stability. And she uses that word, again, stability is used a couple times throughout the book. His job is to give Leia stability. I think Brea even says that at one point to Bail as well. And I just thought like seeing all of these different perspectives was really interesting and important. One of the other things that's great about the book too is we have you mentioned this, Charlotte, about Haki, that it was great that she's an older character. And we have a number of older characters, particularly older senators. Like I think Mon Mothma meets with one senator that's like 200 years old, at least. And they talk about how, you know, the people who have lived through the Clone Wars, it was awful, but it was 3 years. Like, talk to me when this conflict is going on for a lifetime, for longer than a lifetime. Then you'll know real hardship. Then you'll know real tragedy and know how precious something like stability is worth.
Yeah, I feel like the people who are older, it's very important, I think, to have that perspective in this book in particular, because I think we have characters like Bail at some points, I think, is looking very short-sightedly. Like, okay, if I just prove this about the Jedi, then everything about the Jedi's reputation, people will rise up and it'll be fine. Like that'll happen really quickly. As long as I do this one thing, it'll all be worth it. And people who are older have a 1,000-foot view where they can see, it's just it's tit for tat. It's everything just rises and falls. It's just, like you said, the reason why when they're like, the Clone Wars was only 3 years. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah.
And then we experienced the Empire for at least 20 years, 25 years. So,
and it will the Empire will completely rewrite all of this.
Yeah. And there's a quote where one of those senators says, wars never really end.
Yeah.
And I think that's so true. I think we see that in the sequel trilogy, especially. I remember the sequel trilogy when it came out. There's so many people who were like, "Oh, so the Empire's back? Or, okay, we just defeated that." And no, this rise and fall is unfortunately all part of it because we have this sort of erased narratives or short-term memory. And yeah, so it is super important to have these older characters who have this longer view of the history here.
Yeah.
One thing about how Brea says that Bail's job, actually a couple people say that Bail's job is to bring stability for Leia. And I think Bail's arc truly is, in the beginning, he thinks that he's doing, this work around the Jedi, his mission for Leia. And then by the end of it, he realizes that it's so much bigger than that. And I was worried that because this is I don't know. I was going back and forth a little bit around. I think I've already said this. Like, part of me was like, Bail, just go home. Like, you need to bond with your daughter. You just adopted her. Just go home. But he can't. He's Bail Organa, and a rebellion does need to be formed, and it takes all these really small steps. And while we can sit here and be like, this whole mission for the Jedi is sort of pointless, at the end of the day, it's not, because it did bring him closer. It's this whole two steps forward, one step back, or even 2 steps back, 1 step forward, honestly, and that's how they get to this point by at the end when they're having this conversation between Bail, Mon, and Saw Gerrera, which I think is the most important conversation in the book. But that wouldn't have happened without this ups and downs, this doubts, these failures. So I think how do you provide quote unquote stability in a time that is so unstable? You just have to keep pushing.
Yeah.
And whether or not Bail's perspective is sound, I think doesn't necessarily matter. Where I think as a character, his heart was in the right place in a lot of ways. It's just the way that he went about it is just really short-sighted.
Well, I think that's what Mon Mothma even comments about Bail a couple of times. Like, yeah, I would love to, clear the Jedi name.
Yes.
But it's not helpful for us right now. It's not going to get us anywhere. I think even in her speech to Sojin at the end, she says something like, the cause of the Jedi was something I was happy to forget until Bail wouldn't let me, or something like that. Yeah. I wanted to bring up too, in the conversation about stability, what the Separatist leader Nuvolio says to Mon Mothma. He says, "We cannot save ourselves because the only abundance in the galaxy is in the cradle of the Empire." And I think that is such an important point, too, in understanding where all of these senators are coming from in representing their planets, how they do or do not vote for the bill. Because especially for the Separatists, and Nuvolio says this, like, we have them, if for us to vote on this puts us in such a place of risk, way more than you, because of how the galaxy perceives us, what kind of optics this will put on us. And if things go wrong, all it takes is another blockade, another commandeering of our resources, and all of our people will be affected by it. And it would more likely happen to us as the outsiders right now than it would happen to you, Mon Mothma and Chandrila. And all Mon Mothma can say to that is, yeah, you're right, that you guys are at higher risk. And I think it's important that something like this is put in to this book when it comes to understanding how all of these people are operating, and what someone like when you reference Luthen's speech earlier, how he has sacrificed pretty much everything for the cause, and how Mon Mothma is going to get there. She's basically like, I think she knows it's coming. Yeah.
She says she would die for it.
Yeah, exactly.
We're already at that point where she would die for
what's interesting about Mon Mothma is that we're assuming she's pregnant by the end of the book. So now she's, I mean, I think it's baby's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
So, but now it's not just about her. And I'm interested to see how she deals with that in the next installments whenever the baby comes. And also what that will mean for her relationship with Bail, because now they both have these young children that they are trying to create a better galaxy for. Obviously,
that are named really similarly.
yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if that will become a topic too.
Yeah.
I love the Leda storyline.
Me
I
too.
really hope it's a big part of Mon Mothma's story in season 2. I worry it won't be that big because we're going to be skipping a lot of time.
Well, the ultimate sacrifice already happened. Like her marrying away the daughter.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. The marriage hasn't happened yet.
No, it hasn't. But the whole promise and
the
reasoning behind it that Mon truly, like, morally wants nothing to do with already happened. So I do hope it's a big part of Andor, but like I bet we're just going to see the wedding.
Yeah, I think so too. But I love the character of Leda as well, and I would love to see more of her character and the journey she goes on, and whether she becomes more like her father Perrin or more like her mother Mon Mothma as she gets older. Like, also, like, is Leia going to go to the wedding? You know what I mean? Like, I guess they're kind of similar in age.
True. So true.
Things to think about.
Also, what about Mon's relationship with Vel? Like, how do they? Her name is Vel, right? Yeah. I feel like it's been a while since I've watched Andor. We haven't begun our rewatch because as you heard at the beginning, we're very laser focused on one thing before we can move on to the other thing. I know that they know each other. So we need to know, and because I think
they're cousins.
Yeah. So are we going to see her in the next couple of books? Maybe. How does she get involved? That'll be interesting.
Interesting. I don't know how I got on this topic of Leda, but because obviously Mon Mothma has made herself a hypocrite in her own moral eyes to better the galaxy and to fight for the galaxy, right? But she's gonna do it through the Senate for as long as she can. And I think that what we'll see in Andor season 2 is when she realizes she can't do that anymore, that there is no more progress to be made within the Senate. But once you have your own kid, that's going to completely change everything too. It puts a completely different lens over what she's doing. And
what you're fighting for.
Exactly. And I think we see that as well in Andor 2, just in the topic of Leda's marriage and everything like that. So and I think that will, like I said, impact her relationship with Bail and how he had to, like, I wonder if they'll talk about this whole journey of him of realizing that he thought that by saving the Jedi's legacy, he was helping Leia, but he realized it was taking him away from Leia, and that wasn't what was needed.
Tragic.
It is tragic.
Especially like thinking about his end too.
It's so sad. And you think about how by the end of the book, Bail says that he's forgetting the Jedi. He's actively forgetting the Jedi. We have that statue of the Jedi that's at his house that he puts into storage. And the next time, presumably, that he calls on the Jedi is when Leia is kidnapped. And he has to bring back out the ghosts to save Leia.
Wow.
I know. It's kind of a lot.
It is a lot. Okay. Is there anything else that we need to discuss around the themes and characters?
I think we'll be coming back to this book a lot, especially as we move throughout Andor. So yes, but maybe not today.
Yep. Okay, let's move on to quotes.
Listen, big deal. You got another problem. Women always figure out the truth. Always.
Welcome to part 3, where Caitlin and I give each other, without knowing what we're going to read, a page number, and we then react in real time to that quote, how it makes us feel, our first thoughts, and then we reflect on it some more. So we have 2 quotes each. Caitlin, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first.
Okay, great.
Go to page 356. So this is from when Sojin is at the bar, when he's had the argument with the young people that he meets at the bar, asking them about the war. And this is kind of in the middle of the page. The quote goes, "In the chaos of his memory, he couldn't find the names of his brothers who'd gone to fight when they were 12, 13, 14. Age had never been an obstacle to war, and even the Republic had known that, sending clones younger than his brothers onto the battlefield. His mind scrabbled for any thought beyond rage. The man's voice, 'What war,' became the voice of Senator Organa, offering to remove his implants. Quote, 'There's still beauty in the galaxy,' Senator Organa said. 'There's no shame in stepping away from the fight for a day or a lifetime.'"
Ooh, I really like this quote.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing I thought of when it says, "Age is no excuse," he thought, but didn't say it. "In the chaos of his memory, he couldn't find the names of the brothers." Okay. And then he says, "Age has never been an obstacle to war, and even the Republic had known that, sending clones younger than his brothers onto the battlefield." I thought of Ahsoka immediately in that part, because I think this is a big thing that Ahsoka just had never dealt with until the show. Her trauma around being sent into war as a 14-year-old young girl with a new master that she didn't even know or get to bond with at all until the battlefield. And I just think we haven't actually talked enough about how kind and sort of, I'm going to use this word and I hope it doesn't come off as like crass, random it was for Bail to offer this to Sujin, to get to remove his implant so that he wasn't, a contingency plan and instead could live free.
Yeah, and find his own purpose, because the end of the chapter, like I said, this is when Sojin kind of crashes out.
Yeah.
And he says he couldn't stay. He didn't know what his mission was anymore, but he couldn't stay.
Right. And yeah, a really, really good quote, because I think you go back and forth where obviously you want Sujin to take Bail up on his offer, but then you have this other part of you that wants Bail, like I said, to see this through with Sujin. We don't want to make the stop on Alderaan to get him to remove his implants. We want Bail to maybe use him in order to reframe the Jedi's perception in the galaxy. But again, we know that's not going to happen, or we think that's not going to happen because of the way that things actually turn out. So maybe we wish that he did. It's just all part of the tragedy. Star Wars is tragedy, period.
Yeah, and I think that Bail also saying that Sojin could walk away from the war or from the fight for a day or a lifetime, but none of them do that. Bail won't do that. Mon Mothma doesn't do that. Saw doesn't do that. Bail gives that permission to Sojin, but not to himself. I also think that the part, where they're talking about age has never been an obstacle to war, that everyone is affected by a war, no matter how old they are, right? Yes, the Padawans are sent in before they're old enough that they should be having to do something like that. But just like we see throughout the Clone Wars, like tons of children and young people. I mean, we were just talking about young babies being kidnapped by Palpatine. And I think we should have brought this up, but one of, I think, the more chilling quotes of this book is a conversation between Haki and Bail Organa. And I think it's one of their last conversations, actually. And Bail is like kind of pleading his case about, getting justice for the Jedi. And he says to Haki, "You'd rather a madman rule the galaxy than risk standing against him." And Haki says, "Madmen come and go. I've lived a long time." She says some other stuff. And then Bail says, "And massacring a group like the Jedi, that leaves no scars." And she says, "Suppose it does. Doesn't mean the answer is to keep cutting. You're a father now. What are you really doing in this cavern? Your job's to give stability to Leia, not knock down everything for your personal sense of justice." "They killed the Jedi children too," Bail says. Haki looked away. "Then there are no orphans, and they aren't our responsibility." And oh my God, like it just, age has never been an excuse. Has never been an obstacle to war. And yeah, I just think
I also was like, actually, there's so many points where I was like, oh, that's sort of ironic because Bail actually has
an orphan.
That's technically a Jedi orphan.
Yeah. Yep.
There's so many occasions like that where I sort of paused around the irony of it all.
Yeah.
Okay, so my next quote is actually something that we did talk about, but there's a different reason why I want to talk about it. So we're just going to go into it. Okay. It is page 161 into 162. It's in the beginning of the book, really, when Bail and Haki are traveling together in the beginning. of their journey. And it's at the bottom of the page. They spoke little during their journey. Bail found the quiet dismaying, with only the distant drumbeat of the shelling for company. His mind went to places the past day's hectic pace had concealed. He thought of Leia, he thought of Brea, who exuded unspoken doubt when he told her of his plan. He thought of the Jedi survivors fleeing from the clone army and wondered how many of them, especially those he'd aided, were still alive. He thought of Padme Amidala, how horrible her death had been, and how young she'd seemed, even at the end, even with betrayal and disaster tainting her existence. Quote, "Are you doing this for the Jedi or to honor Padme?" Brea had asked him before he left, and he told her that it was all the same. Brea had shaken her head. "No," she said, "it's not." But it was, because Padme's burden and that of the Jedi would pass down to Leia if Bail didn't act. Padme's burden, Obi-Wan's burden, and the burden Anakin Skywalker had cast aside. But it wasn't right. It wasn't right for a child to grow up atoning for the failures of a generation.
I highlighted this too. This is some heavy stuff.
Mhm.
This is some generational stuff. I think there's a lot going on in this quote, but I think the one thing I want to focus on is where it says, you know, Padme's burden, Obi-Wan's burden, and the burden Anakin Skywalker had cast aside. And I think this is a really important word choice to point out, I guess, that Bail understands that Anakin made a choice and that he cast his burden aside. Padme and Obi-Wan left it to be picked up in the view of Bail Organa. And it's the same burden. And that's what Brea asks, you know, is this for the Jedi or for Padme? And to Bail, it's both. He even has this phantom memory at the end of the book about having dinner with Obi-Wan and Padme on Alderaan.
Right. I was like, what is this?
I was like, is this real? And
I know.
even Bail, he's like, I can't remember what we talked about. I can't really even remember like when this happened, but it definitely happened, right?
It did not happen. No.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't think Bail knows either.
Again, that's the doubt that overhangs this entire book.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this whole conversation and this was like part of like wondering what was going through Bail's mind of like, you know, it would become Leia's burden. And it's like, it only becomes Leia's burden if Bail gives it to her. And I think that's where Bail comes to at the end, where he has to put the Jedi away because these ghosts, this burden that he almost died for, would have taken him away from his daughter. And his like connection to Padme and the connection that she represented between him and Mon Mothma is severed. And there's like that chilling moment where Mon Mothma asks him if he's in or out, and he says, "I'm out." And Padme would have been too, and like slams the door. And I was like, oh my God, ow, ouch. Like that was so emotional, you know? And I think this quote is really just showing how kind of deep into this headspace Bail Organa is and how he can't see a way out and he feels bound by duty to these ghosts at this point.
Agreed. I also want to note that it's the one of maybe 2 times Anakin is mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think that informs some of what, of course it does, Bail's need for justice for the Jedi, where I think he doesn't know how to feel about all that. And I can't, it's just sort of unspoken in the book to the point where I kind of wish there was a little bit more around how Bail perceives the fact that what Bail thinks about Padme is that Padme loved the Jedi. She loved a Jedi.
Yeah.
But that's the extent of what he knows about that whole thing, right? And so I guess like there's a little bit of confusion, I guess, around what would Padme do? What would Padme want? But Padme herself, I think to a lot of people, she has strong views, obviously, that I think Mon feels like she knows, Bail feels like she knows. But she also had a hidden part of her. And I wonder if that informs any of Bail's manic vibe around understanding the Jedi, because perhaps he just didn't even understand how much the Jedi meant to Padme.
Yeah.
And if we're finding some retribution for Padme. It's like, oh, she would want this because like she loved the Jedi. She loved a Jedi, but like it's just a little more complicated than that.
Right.
Really complicated. So anyway, that's why I chose the quote.
I think it's a good quote. Anakin, I think that's something we should also put a pin in on when he's used throughout the books, like Palpatine, because he's now with Palpatine.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay, so my last quote for you is on page 448, right near the end. This is right after the meeting of Saw Gerrera, Mon Mothma, and Bail Organa on Ayu Derjowitz.
Sure.
And it starts in the middle of the page. Saw was the first to leave the palace of the High Games Masters. Mon stayed with Bail, vaguely intending to use the time to discuss anything best kept between themselves, but neither she nor Bail spoke much. They'd exhausted themselves and exhausted their thoughts of revolution and assassination and the changing of an era. When Mon heard a vessel streak through the atmosphere, she looked to Bail and said softly, "You're a good man. I do admire you for that." "You shouldn't," he told her, and he clasped her hand before climbing the stairwell.
It's good.
Yeah, it's kind of like a one-off line, but
it's kind of it does kind of shake you up a little bit.
Yeah, like why shouldn't we admire Bail for being a good man, or why wouldn't he want Mon Mothma
to think he's a good man? I think that they are,
or admire him, really.
Yeah, I feel like first off, their friendship and how they know each other is such a big part of this entire book, and finally getting to this point where Mon Mothma, even though they're both exhausted from talking about politics and planning and everything, that's what she ends up saying to him in this like moment of intimacy where he clasps her hand before climbing the stairwell. That's what she says. She says, "You're a good man. I do admire you for that." And it's sort of this thing that throughout the book, Mon Mothma is like, well, everyone likes Bail. He's so popular.
Yeah.
Everyone loves him. And that's sort of the reason why you want him around. You want his adoration. You want his friendship. And I think by the end of it, Mon realizes how much that's not just an outward strength, but it's also something that I think Bail, holds within himself. And I think she admires that, especially since she's just like going through it, I guess, with understanding who she is as someone who like literally killed somebody.
She's crashing out.
So yeah, she's kind of crashing out too.
While they're hanging out.
But I think it's a surprising thing for Bail to say, "You shouldn't admire me for that." I think that maybe they're both dealing with what we were just talking about if Mon is crashing out about it being a killer, Bail's crashing out over his folly and the fact that his whole experience ended in what it is today, right?
Yeah.
So I think they're both sort of dealing with these complexities.
Yeah, Bail, following his idealism of justice, didn't end up actually helping the galaxy, and in fact, basically resulted in the destruction of Ayu Derjowitz. And then Mon Mothma, who actually gets something done with the Imperial Rebirth Act that at this point feels net positive. As she finds out, it's not net positive, but in the moment, it feels net positive. Or maybe net neutral. It's something, right? She got something done, but she killed someone in the process, and that has marked her, right? We talked about the shrapnel in her heart and the metaphors of that too. So it is them. I think you're right. It's them dealing with the complexities of where they are now and how they're going to define themselves as good people moving forward.
Okay. So the next quote and the last quote that we're going to read is on page 312. And again, this is one I feel like we danced around but didn't exactly examine.
Okay.
This is between Sujin and Bail Organa. Sujin felt a spark of fury that failed to catch fire. "Have you ever wondered," he asked, "if you were on the wrong side during the war?" "You want my honest assessment?" Sujin nodded. "I'm not sure there was a right side," the senator said. "I opposed the Separatist Confederacy because it chose violence when other paths remained. It seemed to me, and it still seems to me, that its cruel tactics and disregard for life were inseparable from the greed that drove the Confederacy's corporate elite. I also acknowledge that many well-meaning people saw matters differently and opposed the Republic for good and moral reasons. I've come to wonder if the whole war was sort of faint half misdirection on the part of those who desired an empire. Palpatine and his cronies pushed and pushed until the fighting started. Count Dooku was He paused. The particulars don't matter. But by joining the war, all of us played into Palpatine's hands.
Well, he got it.
Mm-hmm.
He did it.
He solved the Clone War.
he solved the Clone War. Good job, Bail Organa. I think that I had all of this highlighted as well. I think the thing, thinking about like our characters in this scene, I think the first line you read of Sojin felt a spark of fury that failed to catch. This is, I think, the beginning of the end for Sojin, really, because I feel like he's found that fire throughout this book whenever he's needed to. And the fact that he wasn't able to in this moment. And to our conversation too about Padme, this is the conversation that Padme has as well with Anakin in Revenge of the Sith. Do you ever think we're on the wrong side of the war? Yep. And it's ironic because Padme and Bail, they're both having the same thoughts, and other people in the Senate are as well, about what's really going on here. And it's just sad because throughout all of this, like, Sojin is so bereft about his family and his clan and what happened to them, and he's meeting all these people who, even though Sojin had power, is the wrong word, I think, for what Sojin had when he was actually an operative, I guess. But he's meeting all these people who had and held a lot of power, and nothing was able to change. And now he's like being forced to work with them again. And then he has someone like Bail be like, yeah, I don't think there was actually a right side. I don't think I was on the wrong side, and I don't think there was a right side. And it all feels like it was for nothing. And I think Sojin hearing that, it's like, then everything I lost was for nothing. Like, my clan was lost for nothing. And I think a lot of people were impacted in the same way throughout the Clone Wars. What I like a little further on in this conversation between the two of them is Sojin notes a couple of times that he thinks that Bail thinks he's better than Sojin, and that like he like has the answers and stuff like that. And they talk about how like the separatists like blocked food and had all these droids out and like used the corporations and their money to move the war forward. And I love what Sojin says here a little later in the conversation. He says, but by the end, I believed in the separatist cause. I believed in the side that didn't breed soldiers in vats or send diplomats to make peace with laser swords. I believed that even if the Republic was little worse than the Confederacy, it held too much power. The galaxy was better off divided. And I just think that's, they talk about this comparison between the clones and the droids and the Jedi as all of these weapons throughout the war a couple of times. And as we know, it was all playing into Palpatine's hands.
Mm-hmm. I chose it because I thought it was fascinating that between these two characters, we get the repeat conversation of Padme to Anakin. Mm-hmm. We know how that conversation with Padme to Anakin ends, which is explosive. And then Padme tries to calm down Anakin around that, even though she was just kind of shooting the shit a little bit. And I feel like I don't know. I think that what Bail had to say is sort of what we wished would be the conversation, I guess, between Padme and Anakin in Revenge of the Sith, right?
Yeah.
This like redo has all the answers in it.
Yeah, exactly. A little too little too late.
Too late.
Yeah.
It's like, of course, in hindsight, you see it.
And that's the tragedy.
And then I guess if the spirit of Padme is hanging over the book, then this question is only natural because she was asking it during the end of the war when it did matter.
Yeah.
But it wasn't really heard.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the question isn't coming from Bail, though. It's coming from Sojin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Great book.
Oh, man.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I can't wait for the others.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too. Is there anything else, any parting shots you want to give about The Reign of Empire? Mask of Fear by Alexander Freed.
No, I just think it was great. I really enjoyed it. We actually, on our Patreon Discord, Tom Holler, who is awesome editor over at Del Rey Books, the Star Wars imprint at Del Rey, or Random House Worlds, I should say. Random House Worlds. He did a little reading before the book was out with a bunch of passages. And I thought it was kind of fun to kind of piece together. He never told us where they were in the book, to sort of piece together what he had read for us, which was so awesome. And on Discord and like the voice channel and for our patrons there, and sort of like piece it all together. It was really fun.
Yeah, I was thinking about that the whole time I was reading it too, because I had been taking notes during that live reading. So I had them out and was compare and contrasting. It's very fun. I think this is a great book, and I'm excited that we have it now in the Star Wars world, especially heading into Andor season 2. I think we're going to have some things to cross-reference between these two things, Andor and the Mask of Fear.
Totally.
All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for us this week. Thank you guys so much for listening. We really appreciate it. We've got an Andor episode coming up. We've got a Celebration Packing for Japan episode coming up, because Celebration Japan is coming up
next month.
Really coming up really fast. And we've got a few other episodes too before then. So don't go anywhere. Don't change the channel. Don't step away. We'll be back.
We'll be right back.
We'll be right back after these messages. But really, thank you guys so much for listening. We would love to know what you thought of the Mask of Fear. You can tell us on this, I guess, commercial break on Twitter /X at SkyTalkersPod, or our personal handles. Mine is at Caitlin Plesher. Charlotte's is at Clarity. We also have our Instagram, our TikTok, where, like Charlotte mentioned, you can see full clips from some of our other episodes, like the Revenge of the Sith commentary, for example. We also have our Facebook, our website, skytalkers.com. You can also email us hello@skytalkers.com. And if you have a couple seconds and would like to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we would so appreciate it, as it helps other people find our show. And if you're looking for more ways to support the show, you can head on over to our Patreon and check out our reward tiers there, and how to get involved in our wonderful, fabulous Discord community,
which I'm sure is going to be very active during the Andor season, which I guess we're getting a movie a week. Hello. Okay.
We can't.
We're tired already.
I can't mentally process that.
No, me neither. I'm just going to process it as it comes.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. It'll be fine. Okay. I want to say a huge thank you to these patrons: Ben, David, Mercedes, Greg, Jonah, Linda, Catherine, Draconius Rex, Emily, GMO, Gary, Kat, Jenny, Jeremy, Kimberly, Katie, Emma, Blessed Cheesemaker, Fifi, Brad, Neil, Arzu, Blast Point, Daniel, Colton, Savannah, Derek, Z, Cherie, Talia, Patrick, and Tadashi. Thank you so much for supporting us.
Yes, thank you guys so much. And until next time, may the Force be with you.
May the Force be with you.
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.